Welcome to Unit 2, The Media of Art. Lesson 5, Evaluating Art. The role of evaluation is discussed in this lesson in terms of questions. What makes a work of art worthwhile? Is it visually interesting? Is it moving? Is it skillfully done? Which criteria are relevant to judging art, and who is qualified to make such judgments? Our objectives for this lesson are to discuss the subjective biases involved in evaluating a work of art, compare formal, contextual, and expressive approaches used in art criticism, examine the relationship of art's economic, cultural, and personal value to issues of quality and social context, combine factual, analytical, and evaluative information to write an essay about an artwork. Explain censorship as a type of evaluation based on political, moral, or religious values. Our outline for this chapter: evaluation, art criticism, formal theories, contextual theories, and expressive theories. What makes art great? Evaluating art with words, and censorship, the ultimate evaluation. We have a small vocabulary for this lesson located on this page and on our Moodle page. To begin our discussion on evaluating art, we're going to be contrasting, comparing two images. On our left we have Shy Glance from 1976, and on our right we have Self-Portrait in a Straw Hat from 1782. For me, evaluating art comes with the territory, so it's easy for me to compare these two images as our text has and talk about the positives and negatives within the two works. Now, most of the negatives are going to fall on the image in the left, Shy Glance, whereas the positives will be associated with the self-portrait in a straw hat. Now, as an instructor, I know how I teach my students how to render certain parts of the body. So when we look at the image on the left, the eyebrow, the way the eye is rendered, the patchiness of the skin, and overall rendering of the hair is uncomplicated and simple. This image was actually found in the trash, so who exactly threw it away, whether it was the artist or not, I don't necessarily know, but maybe the person was also not necessarily satisfied with the work that they did. Now, when you look at the context of a body of work of a particular artist, sometimes they start at a certain point and they end up at a certain point, being much more sophisticated along the road as they practice their craft. On the right, we have an example of that, although when we look at the time period, 1782, and especially that this was painted by a woman, the reason being, in that time period, women only were making art and exhibiting in public if they had some type of association with a father that was a wealthy merchant or businessman, possibly in politics or something that could pay for the schooling of their child. Is much more complicated with a female at that time to actually make a name for herself. So usually we will find the women that shine at this particular time period were making the point that they are just as good of painters as the men. So if you look at the two images, you can definitely see how the one on the right, Straw Hat, is rendered with a certain degree of sophistication and confidence. And when we look at the image on the left, your text kind of talks about this inherent shyness that's kind of represented in this image, and maybe the artist also had that feeling while they were making the work, and that's part of the aspect of making a judgment on a work. Now, the next several slides we'll be going over them in the context of three dominant theories of art criticism. The definition of art criticism is making discriminating judgments, both favorable and unfavorable, in relation to a work of art. There are three dominant types of art criticism. The first is formal theories, which focuses attention on the composition, which is the formal organization of the work, and how it may have been influenced by earlier works. Number two, contextual theories. Consider art as a product and of a culture and a value system. And number three, expressive theories. Pay attention to the artist's attempt to express a personality or worldview. We're now going to look at 3 different images and discuss them under the context of their art criticism theory. So this first group of 3 will be under the formal theories, and the next 2 will be under contextual and expressive theories. This painting here is by Titian, titled Pietà, from 1576. Now, if you know a little bit of art history, you'll know that everything that's in this painting was given to him, in a sense, by his predecessors, Michelangelo, Leonardo da Vinci, for example, from the Renaissance. And during that particular period of time, artists were really free to start to loosely express themselves in the way they were painting and making images. This really does not come until full fruition for probably another 400 years, until the late 1800s, where artists are really challenging the establishment. But there's a little bit of that going on at this time period too. But they actually become the establishment in a positive way, that they've come up with these new ways to make paintings that challenge the way the painting had been done for several hundred years. When we look at this, this has kind of a combination of a symmetrical and an asymmetrical composition. If you look at the figures at the bottom, they do form kind of a pyramid or a triangle, but it is shifted off to the left. But we do have the strong balance from the altar that's behind them, the stone altar with the 2 figures to the left and the right. Now, the aspect of painting in here is something that's always going to be done in painting, probably from the late 1500s up until the late 1700s, until it becomes a little bit more common for artists to do it, but it's called painterly. There's a little bit more technical aspect where the color is kind of mixed in a very specific way to help express a certain idea, but here also painterly is a loose, expressive brushwork that it was not very common probably 100, 150 years before that. Now we have this aspect of art that will have a big influence on other artists to come, and they keep on using the ideas to challenge themselves and come up with new ways to paint. When we look at this painting by Sonia Delany Turk, Simultaneous Contrast from 1913, in a formal theory context, we know also during the time period from 1913 that she's being very influenced by the Cubist movement that started roughly about 5 or 6 years before this painting was made. She took this and actually made it her own. When we look at other Cubist paintings and Cubist works at the time period, they also have this gritting sensibility, but what she's doing is a little bit different than the Cubists, that there may not be an overall obsession with showing something from all sides. At this time period, we have other artists coming around that are really trying to encourage some type of expression through art. So you may be trying to express a certain feeling that you get by seeing something, or a color, something else. But she really shows the context of the time and what was influential art at that particular time. Now we are looking at Jean-Michel Basquiat's Horn Players from 1983 in a formal theory context. What's interesting about talking about this one, unlike the 2 other images that we looked at, and we can kind of put our finger on exactly what came before them, you can still discuss this formally, in the sense that Jean-Michel Basquiat was a very original artist. He stands out as painting in a way that no one had ever really seen before in the context of an art gallery. Now, the things that were influencing him as an artist, what was going on in the subways of New York and other areas by graffiti artists. There's a certain delicate balance of disorder and order in this image that does kind of bring him to a master level. He wound up working with Andy Warhol quite a bit in the 80s, and he unfortunately died too young. When looking at Titian's Pietà in a contextual context, You reflect upon what was going on in the culture at the time and what other artists were doing also at the time. Altarpieces were a very popular form of art at the time, being commissioned not only by churches and nobility, but also by wealthy merchants and such. But this was a big part of the influence of the Renaissance on painting at the time, even though religion was a big aspect of art still. We're going to learn later, we're going to talk about humanism and this more inward looking aspect of ourselves as human beings, and it's going to be expressed in painting. They still are very religious people at the time, but they also believe in the potential for mankind. So that's also a big aspect of any artist working in this particular time period. Sometimes, when talking about modern art in a contextual theory, things can get a little complex, especially when we think about simultaneous contrasts. It doesn't overly, when we look at the image, describe necessarily what was going on culturally at the time period. Maybe some interest that the artist had, so to say. So it doesn't fit in that over contextual picture like when we look at Titian's Pietà. Now, the particular name simultaneous contrast does refer to an optical theory that many artists studied in that particular time period. These kind of theories of optics and physics of light and color started in the 1870s with the Impressionists and still was a big influence on the Expressionists and the artists that came afterwards, such as Delany Turk, as we see in this image. Looking at horn players from Jean-Michel Basquiat contextually, it's a little bit easier to diagnose this image than the previous one. This is a tribute essentially to the jazz pioneers of the 1940s. We have Charlie Parker, Dizzy Gillespie in the image. Now, something that's kind of interesting are the in-depth aspects to subversion, in a sense, that Basquiat went to. The nickname for Charlie Parker was Bird. When we talk about ornithology, that is the study of birds. So, kind of interesting way to kind of refer to his name and pay a little bit of a tribute. But there's always this fascination with words in a lot of Jean-Michel Basquiat's work, and strongly encourage any of you to look him up. They don't always have these jazz themes. There's other things going on at the time. Now, sometimes when we're dealing with art within the past 40, 50 years, there's a lot of commentary on other artists. So this context of time within our modern period is going to be a lot different than the artists that we looked at previously, in a sense that Basquiat in 1983 is reflecting back to the 1940s for the context of his particular work. Sometimes when we look at art that dates 500 years and earlier, it gets a little murky when we want to discuss it in an expressive theory context of art criticism. Being that starting in the late 1890s is when artists really were feeling comfortable at expressing feelings of anxiety and fear and other such matters, whereas the expression of a certain type of attitude or feeling in the 1500s during the Renaissance would reflect much more of an outward cultural common theme. I brought up humanism before. So when we look at this particular piece, this is painted in the last year of Titian's life. And if you look in the lower right-hand corner, the person on their knees in the shawl is actually a portrait of Titian. So there are some theories that there's some self-reflection on the artist's own mortality when he was painting this particular piece. Sticking with the expressive theories, when we look at simultaneous contrasts, its time period, 1913, is at the peak when artists are really starting to feel comfortable with expressing themselves through their artwork. Now, we looked at this through a technical eye before, where there's some Cubist influence in here, but there's also some influence from her heritage. She's from Ukraine, and the colors that are in this painting are representative of the folk costumes that are from her particular area. She was also known as a bright and radiant person, and the colors also reflect that aspect of her personality. And last, for our expressive theories, it's kind of easy looking through that eyeglass at Basquiat's horn players. Now, he had a strong personal interest in jazz, but also expressing himself. He many times would replace words in teeth in many of his different images, as we see here in the center panel of this image. Fascination with words. It's almost like you get into the mind of the artist. We're going to finish this lesson talking about censorship, which is perhaps the ultimate evaluation of art. Artists had a long relationship with censorship, going back to the early Christians, and how for the first few hundred years of their existence they had to worship rather privately, and the symbols of that worship, which usually involved painting or sculptures and such, had to be hidden because they'd have certain reprisals due to their beliefs, be it death or banishment or anything else that came along with that. Now, uh, during the Middle Ages and later, you couldn't deal with certain religious icons in a certain fashion without getting also some type of reprisal from the church or the government at the time. Now, probably our most recent strong history with censorship is during the Nazi era, fascism, uh, during World War II and before, when, especially in Germany, Adolf Hitler was trying to determine exactly what art meant to people. Now, what we're looking at here is The Holy Virgin Mary from 1996 by Chris O'Feely. This may offend some people. This is a mixture of elephant dung, which is actually a traditional way of painting in Africa, but your book kind of skips over this aspect that there's also some dirty pictures in there that are representative of flowers and other shapes. Now, I'm sure there's a little bit of intent by the artist to shock you and get some reaction out of you. That does come with the territory, and that's in my opinion, of course. I'm sure many other people will look at this either with some type of praise or complete negative reaction. And we have been talking about looking at art through a critical eye, and it is kind of easy, at least, to survive within the art realm. At least it remains a conversation. You may like it, you may not, but it's here with us, and we're going to continue to have our conversation about it. The last image we'll be looking at for Lesson 5 is History of Labor in Maine from 2007 by Judy Taylor. Now, this is more in recent times, and we still have to deal with censorship in some fashion. Some people felt that this particular painting showed a certain favoritism towards organized labor and a bias against business. And it took a while, but this was up for a few years. By 2011, the government of Maine successfully was able to remove this by claiming ownership of the piece, and they were allowed to basically do whatever they wanted with it. Even though the artist protested and wanted it on exhibit, ultimately this was a commissioned work, and it was taken down and brought to an undisclosed location. Thanks for listening. That was Lesson 5.